Sorry, YouTube's being fickle. And we are now live on YouTube as well. Anyone who's joining us on YouTube, again, thank you. And without further ado, I am going to turn the webinar over to Kelly and Matthias.
Cool. Thanks, Ben. Matthias, how are you?
I am well. Thank you so much for having me.
Good. So happy to have you here. Yeah, Matthias and I met a while ago at the Q Christian Fellowship Conference about 3 years ago when he had just come out with this book. So really excited. We haven't seen each other since then in person, unfortunately, but hopefully that changes soon. But I'll introduce Matthias real quick. So Matthias uses he, him pronouns. He's a queer psychotherapist, a podcaster. He runs this really cool podcast called Queerology, which I highly suggest that you go and listen to. So many good interviews on there. He runs another podcast where he's a co-host called Selfie with fellow therapist Kristen Howerton. He has two master's degrees, one in counseling from the Seattle School, two master's degrees, one in theology and culture, and one in counseling psychology from the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology. Matthias has been featured on Oprah, Sojourners, Bustle, Women's Day, the Seattle Times, lots of publications. And he specializes in helping LGBTQ plus people recover from religious and spiritual trauma so that they might live confident and fulfilling lives. A little bit about me, well, real quick too, he also has a book coming out, which I'm also excited for, called Holy Runaways. This will be released next year in the fall. So we can have Matthias talk about that a little bit today too. But today we're gonna talk about his book, Beyond Shame, Creating a Healthy Sex Life on Your Own Terms. Short blurb about me. My name is Kelly. I'm broadcasting from London right now. So me and Matthias are 8 hours apart with time zones. So it's 6 o'clock here for me. I'm watching the sunset and Matthias just woke up, and most of you I think are probably in between these time zones. So thanks a lot for joining. And as we go through the webinar, like Ben said, please pop some questions into the chat, and we'll be sure to get to those. Yeah, so I live in London, going to school here. I have a MA from Union Theological Seminary. I'm currently going to the London School of Economics, studying economics and public administration. I've been a part of Love Boldly for about 4 or 5 years now. I'm on the board here, and really excited about the work that we're doing. And so let's talk about this book, Beyond Shame. I wanted to start out I'm really excited to interview you too, because I remember at this conference when you were I went to a session where you were talking about your book. I remember it was like a breath of fresh air because I hadn't encountered a book like this before, because maybe some people listening might identify with this, but coming out as queer, growing up very conservative fundamentalist, I kind of deconstructed these very conservative sexual ethics, and then I adopt an affirming theology. And I'm still trying to, at that time, I was trying to figure out what does being Christian look like for me, and how does that reconcile with my sexual ethics? And I couldn't find any resources about it because it just felt like no one felt comfortable talking about sex. And then this book came along. So, and I particularly found it helpful hearing about these two opposites that you're talking about between shamefulness and shamelessness. And I think growing up conservative, we're very used to shamefulness, or growing up queer, that's definitely very common. But I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about how you're defining shame, and then how you define these two poles and what everything in between looks like.
Yeah. I mean, I think my experience was really similar to yours, Kelly, in that sense of when I was coming out, when I was trying to navigate this world of where I grew up deep in very conservative sexual ethic, deep kind of in the throes of purity culture. Folks are familiar with that kind of movement, where the idea is sex is only permissible between one man, one woman within marriage, and anything outside of that is sinful and you're going to hell and ruining your life at the same time. Like all of the above, all the horrible things can happen to you. And so when I was navigating this, similar, looking for resources, and there were not many people talking about this. And so I started doing a lot of work, talking to people, studying this in my master's program, and just trying to figure out like how are people navigating this, and then kind of wrote this book based off of a lot of what I was kind of finding, hearing other people talk about, what I was putting together with some of my clinical work. And so the first thing that I really noticed was like a lot of people, if not the majority of people I talked to, including myself, had a massive amount of sexual shame. This sense of, I may believe that I may have changed my sexual ethics. I may have kind of refined my theology around sex and sexuality. And yet I still have this kind of deeply embodied sense of there is something shameful about sexuality. And people were really trying to figure out, like, what do I do with that? And I mean, I think about shame in this realm of, I mean, the really basic definition that many people are maybe familiar with is the difference between guilt and shame. And I think Brene Brown talks about this a whole lot. Shame saying, I am bad, I am horrible. It's a self-defining kind of state. Whereas guilt is, I have done something bad, something I'm not proud of. And so that distinction between I am versus I have done, shame is really insidious. And you can hear even in that saying, I am bad, I am something I'm not proud of, that's hitting core pieces of identity. I believe our sexuality also exists at really core places of our identity. I also believe that the divine exists at really core places of our identity. And so when those three things come together, shame, sexuality, the divine, we can get into some pretty big messes. And so my hope for this book was really to kind of start to build a pathway out of that. And that's where these two poles kind of come in, is I see them, I talk about them as coping mechanisms. They're ways that people attempt to work with their own shame so that they don't have to deal with it, but neither of them actually gets rid of the shame. So shamefulness is this idea that I think a lot of us who were raised in really conservative worlds are very familiar with. It's when we use shame to control our sexuality, when we try to will it into submission, using all of these shaming messages about sexuality being bad, me being bad for having sexual attraction, so on and so forth. So shamefulness is that kind of realm. You're using shame to control your sexuality. But I also noticed that as people started to kind of work with their shame and in some ways come out of that shamefulness, that there's also kind of this opposite realm that I talk about as being shamelessness, which is where we kind of shift into this realm of, I'm not going to experience shame, and so I'm going to actually use my sexuality to control the shame. So when we're in that state, we may be trying on new sexual ethics. We may be kind of like trying out all kinds of new things and trying to figure things out. So it's not necessarily about the behavior, but it's more about the fact that we're using our sexuality to control the shame instead of actually working with the shame that is present. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I guess that's also why in your book you're not going around saying like we shouldn't do this or this is what our sex life should look like. You are talking about like the motivations and the intentions underneath, and like whether or behaviors connected to shame or not.
Mm-hmm. Yes, right. My big goal with this book was not to write another book that dictates to people what their sexuality should look like. Like, we have far too many of those books. I wanted to craft a book that would kind of come alongside people and help people figure it out for themselves based on their own values, based on what they believe in, and trusting that people can figure that out for themselves with maybe some framework. Yeah.
I'm also thinking, like possibly for people who may not be very familiar with like purity culture or growing up fundamentalist, since obviously like people can have sexual shame without that, but can you explain a little bit about what purity culture is and how it operates and like why, like how it functions in making us so shameful?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is my definition. A lot of other people use different definitions for purity culture. And it was, I mean, it was this large movement that kind of birthed in the 80s, 90s, although it has some roots in the 70s too. But it was this movement that was kind of based on this idea that humans are called to be sexually pure, and that purity only exists, like I said, within a straight heterosexual marriage. And anything that falls outside of that makes you impure. So, I mean, you can already hear the setup there. Like, there's purity and then there's impurity. And there's really rigid boundaries around what those things mean. And when you're impure, tie that in with all these ideas of like virginity, or this idea of like, if you have sex, you're ruined for life, or you're bonded with that person for life. Like, there are all of these messages around how powerful sex and sexuality is, and how we kind of have to keep it within these bounds. Otherwise, we become impure and are ruined. It is really, really damaging. Really damaging.
Yeah, can you also talk a little bit about that, about like, because I mean, I also had like youth pastors growing up where it would say like you're bonded with this person for life when you have sex with them. And what I also like about your book is how you go into the science of like the brain, the chemicals in your brain that are firing when you're having sex, every stage of the process. So my question to you is, am I permanently bonded to whoever I have sex with?
No, you're not. But I think we can complexify this a little bit, because there is some complexity here, and I think the really difficult thing about is when we work with complexity around sexuality is, at least for me, I have this like little youth pastor that feels like he's always over my shoulder, like trying to use anything against me. And so like, if we start to bring into some complexity, that youth pastor speaks up and say like, see, it is sinful. And that makes it really hard to talk about these things, because the reality is that when we do have sex, there is a connection that is formed. It is not a permanent connection. You're not like stuck with that person forever. You don't form, I mean, there is this realm. I didn't grow up in this world, but I hear a lot of people talk about it, like you form soul ties with another person when you have sex with them. So you're like bonded for life, like all these different things. Like, that's not true. But because of the neurochemistry of what's happening and the way that human relationships work, is connection is formed and intensified with sexual activity. But there are also ways to navigate that and to work with it if you're just wanting to maybe hook up or have sex kind of a little bit more casually. We can work with those things and mitigate them, instead of kind of buying into this fear-based idea that we have sex with a person and somehow magically we're bonded with them for forever.
And what type of like communication or internal work do you think that takes to like approach this part of sex that connects us to people? Like, so say for example, if you just want to hook up with someone.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think getting clear on what your values are and what you want out of your sexuality is a really important place to start. So, and that can look excuse me, that can look different for different people. Excuse me again. I'll kind of talk about this from my experience, but my fear whenever I talk about my experiences, it sounds like I'm kind of dictating other people's experiences. I'm not. This is what I have kind of come to with myself is like, for me personally, I won't have sex with someone that I'm like worried about forming a connection with, like, because of that reality of connections get formed and emotional connections get formed, and it does make things more complex in relationships when sexuality gets introduced. I also know, like, say I do just want to hook up with someone, like, and like, I don't really like this person that much, but like, I do want to hook up, like, I can work with those things in myself and within those relationships too. So there's blurriness there. But I think, yeah, getting clear on what you want, what your goals are, and then also being aware of the neurochemistry, what happens in your body, what happens relationally when you have sexual experiences can be really helpful when you kind of start to work with those parts of yourself. I'm happy to talk about some of those things too.
Cool. You also, this is something that I was hoping to get some clarification with your book too. You talk about this thing called the trust floor. What is that?
Yeah. Well, let's get into the neurobiology. So the kind of major chemicals that you want to be aware of in kind of this realm of sexuality is oxytocin, vasopressin, which are both hormones of connection. There's also dopamine, which is a hormone of pleasure. There's also a hormone called prolactin that gets released. And really briefly, on the kind of sexual attraction scale to orgasm level, and then kind of after orgasm, when people orgasm, you have an extreme rush of dopamine, of pleasure, but you also have a massive spike in oxytocin and vasopressin, which are the hormones of connection. The really interesting thing about oxytocin and vasopressin is that even though they spike during an orgasm, they are hormones that kind of build levels over time. So where dopamine just kind of goes like this, the more you experience these rushes of oxytocin and vasopressin, they don't just happen in orgasm. They happen relationally, like they get released like when you cuddle with someone, when you hug someone, anyone. Like these are the hormones that get released with contact, with relationality. But those rise over time. So they're kind of on this level of, if you continue to see a person, you continue to feel pleasurable with them, not just sexuality, but just kind of overall pleasure, like those are going to raise up and you're going to feel more content with that person. And I call that the trust floor, because you're starting to build this floor of experience with another person where you not just kind of emotionally, but on a body-based level are forming this kind of deeper connection with them that you can fall back on. That doesn't happen. Like, you don't have that in a hookup. So it gets really interesting when, if you just hook up with someone, you've never seen them before in your life, you have that spike of dopamine, you have that spike of oxytocin, vasopressin, those kind of really good feelings. But what happens after orgasm is this neurochemical called prolactin gets released. Prolactin is a dopamine inhibitor, which means your dopamine plummets. So that really good feeling goes away pretty quickly. I don't know if you've ever had this experience after sex, but like that kind of post-sex, like, I don't know, depression or clarity or like whatever, where you're like, oh, I actually really don't like this person. Like, what have I done? And a lot of people, like, shame will rush in that moment really quickly when you've been raised in kind of religious conservative environments, and say like, this is because you're sinful. This is like blah, 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 blah. But what's really happening is like your dopamine has just gone away and there is no other chemical structure kind of built around this relationship. You don't have that trust floor to fall back on that has kind of given you an emotional floor with that person. And so dopamine's gone and you're kind of just left cold in
Yeah.
this. I mean, it's almost like a hangover in some ways. Um,
Hmm.
and yeah, does that make sense? I would be curious for even people listening. Like, did that feel jumbled or did it feel like I explained it?
No, I think that makes a lot of sense too, because that's why I think it's so important to like know about the chemicals of it, because otherwise you're like, oh, this is real shame. This is like something I
Mhm.
should feel guilty about,
Right.
rather than like, oh, I have a chemical pumping through my brain right now that makes me feel tired, and like I just
Yep.
like I'm just thinking about all my actions that I've just done.
Right. Right. Because I mean, yeah, your dopamine truly is inhibited. So, and that is one of those main chemicals that makes you feel really good. And without the presence of, yeah, of the oxytocin, vasopressin that's get built over time, it can feel really awful if you
Mm,
kind of don't have something built up with someone. That is not to say we can mitigate those things, but it's really important to be aware of that will likely happen just neurochemically when you have a hookup or are kind of introducing sexuality into a relationship before maybe something deeper has been formed. Not a bad thing, but
yeah.
it can be really confusing.
Yeah, well, thanks to people also mirroring these experiences in the chat. Um, I think so. This also makes me think of, like, you also talk about these paradoxes of sex. One of them being sex makes us vulnerable and helps us avoid vulnerability.
Hmm.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Yeah. So I really wanted to frame this portion of the book when we're really talking about kind of building a sexual ethic in this sense of here are the things that you can navigate to figure out what your sexual ethic is for yourself. So, not prescribing an ethic, but more like here are the things that I believe are true about sexuality, that when we navigate them, it actually informs how we want to live that out in the world. So there's four main paradoxes I work with, and one of them is this. I think is paradox number two is that sex is vulnerable and helps us avoid vulnerability. So the reality is like when we have a sexual encounter, it can be some of the most vulnerable experiences we ever have, both like emotionally, but also just like physically. Like we're taking our clothes off with another person, we're exposed. Like, there's a lot of vulnerability that happens in those moments. And we also can use sexuality to avoid many different feelings. I mean, there's the classic example of like couples or partners having sex to avoid arguing, right? Like you're
Mm,
instead of getting into it with your partner, you're just going to have that kind of quick fire of kind of almost fake vulnerability in that moment to rebond you instead of actually dealing with what's under the surface. Or you're feeling really insecure, so you go out to the club and hook up instead of dealing with your insecurity. Again, not judgment there, not critique there, but that reality of sexuality can be used to avoid vulnerability pretty easily. But it also makes us really vulnerable. And so we can start to then ask questions around what do I want? What am I doing? If I'm feeling drawn to kind of have a sexual experience, is it because I feel really connected and want to have this sexual experience with this person, or is there more happening that I'm trying to run away from? And then we can
mm.
choose into that and say, yeah, I am running away from something and that feels good. But at least we're aware of what we're doing. Um,
And then what about the healthy and risky paradox
mhm.
of sex being healthy and risky at the
Yeah.
same time?
Yeah, yeah. I think this paradox number one: sex is healthy and risky, and I mean the reality is sex is really good for us. Like, and many humans are kind of, I would say, even designed to have sexual experiences. Like, there are a lot of good things that happen in your body when you orgasm, and also like just even on a very practical level, there's STIs. There are like the emotional things that can happen when you have sex with someone. Like there are so many things that make it really risky as well. And so being aware, like it is really good, and we kind of have to respect the reality that it's a really powerful tool of connection and disconnection. And
Mhm.
um, yeah, how do we navigate that?
Yeah, I remember, yeah, like even, yeah, even once I got to like a more like affirming position, sex positive position, I remember like at first like feeling, especially like in the queer community, I was just told like, oh, you have to be careful, like you're gonna get an STI or something like that. And in purity culture, and well, in fundamentalist Christian culture, you're told that if you're queer, like you're just more likely to get an STI, or you have the AIDS crisis hanging over us. That's like really like ingrained in how we're taught by our elders about like what queer people are like. And so like once you finally deconstruct and everything, then you're like, oh my God, like it's like I'm like so scared to actually like engage with people intimately and be vulnerable with people. Um, and so yeah, I think like that's like another thing too, because also like I don't know about you, but like I went to a public high school that did not have good sex education.
Right, right.
And I think like many people in the US had that experience where it was just abstinence.
Hmm.
Like where and like there's many schools that I'm pretty sure are still preaching at or teaching abstinence.
Yep.
And so I think like once you move out of that, it's so scary because
Hmm.
I just like had to educate myself at like age 20.
Hmm. Right. Well, and that reality of, I mean, yeah, what you're putting language to is one, there are very few places in the United States. Like, it's like literally like you can kind of go into like there are individual schools, and that's roughly it, that teach comprehensive sexual education.
Mm.
Really doesn't exist in the United States, which is just awful that we're not getting that. Pair that with then the reality that many people are getting their sexual education from porn, because that's like the most kind of accessible place to learn, because you know, you can watch it, you can kind of see what other people are doing, and that's a really difficult place to learn sexual education. Like you you're not, it's not a comprehensive sexual education learning about sex from porn. um, and so that sets up a really difficult bind for straight people, but I mean, I think even more so for queer people, because there's that shame of even asking questions or not even knowing who we can turn to, because a lot of us grew up really isolated. Like,
Mm.
how do we learn how to even do this, how to do this safely, um, and get away from a lot of the fear mongering that
Yeah,
is pervasive?
yeah, absolutely. Um, okay, I want to pivot a little bit right now. And in the meantime, we have about probably about 25 minutes left before we like go into like actual questions. So please put some questions in the chat so we have some good content to go over once we get to that. But now I'm kind of curious if you could put on your theology and seminary hat. So like we're kind of talking about like what it means to construct our own sexual ethics, and then like I had the youth pastor on my shoulders like you can't construct your own sexual ethics. Like there is there is like one sexual ethic that you have to follow. You can't twist the Bible into what you want it to say. And so what does the Bible say about sex? And like what like how does it define sex? Like
Uh-huh.
what is like are we allowed to masturbate? Like what is the Bible actually saying about these things?
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, when I approached this section of the book, of kind of like dealing with the Bible, dealing with scripture, and kind of, and also these cultural, like church-based messages around sexuality, my big goal was not necessarily to try to argue a theological point. That's something that I'm honestly not interested in, and there's a lot of other people who can do it way better than me. What I was interested in is kind of muddying the waters around this idea that the Bible is clear. that the Bible has a singular thing to say about sexuality, because that is just not true. And so my goal was really like, can we just introduce and kind of muddy up this idea that there is one clear sexual ethic presented in the Bible? Because that's what I was taught. I was taught that the Bible has one thing to say: don't have sex before marriage, marry a woman. And that was the only thing. But as I started diving into kind of the research around this, I realized, like, I mean, scholars have been arguing about this for a very long time. And so much of it, I think, falls into more of our kind of ideological ideas than what the Bible is actually saying. And people would disagree with me on that, and I'm okay with that. But there's a lot of complexity in how we're defining terms. For example, the term fornication, which is kind of the term that is most widely used in the New Testament, and that gets kind of translated as sexual immorality. There are actually 6 different translations of that, the word, the Greek word, that mean widely different things. And so, I mean, you can kind of go on track and see, like, the translators are kind of choosing meanings based off of what I would argue are kind of cultural ideals. So really, again, I'm not trying to argue a theological point, but more open up this idea of, can we allow there to be complexity in the way we read scripture? And can we start to kind of look into these things a little bit deeper than what we have been taught, and realize, like, there's a lot more going on in scripture than what we were taught in purity culture.
Yeah, I remember you also have this section of the book where you go into the Garden of Eden story about the creation of Adam, kind of being this, like, genderless human at first when, like, he's created. And that you're trying to talk about, like, how, like, gender is talked about in the Bible too, and like how you have this gender hierarchy that was imposed onto the reading, like, later on. And obviously, like, there was certain ideas about gender held by the writers of the Bible, but the way we've interpreted it over the years has changed dramatically, like, from period to period.
Right. I think it's Phyllis Tribble is who I pulled a lot of that section from, and her readings of the Genesis, the creation story, and her observations around that. When, I mean, the direct translation of who we would call Adam, the direct translation is the earth creature. When the earth creature was created in the original text, there was not gender assigned to that. But I mean, it's literally translated the earth creature. Gender isn't actually assigned in the text, in the original language, until God does his little magic and we have Adam and Eve. That's the first time gender is even introduced into the concept. So this idea that the man was created first is false. we actually have a genderless or a genderful individual initially, and then that gets separated into male, female, and there's a lot of queer theologians do a lot of really fun and interesting things with that. Like Austin Hartke in his book Transforming plays with that a lot. Like, but it's this fascinating idea that directly goes against some of these ideas of gender hierarchy, patriarchy, etc., that gets read into the text.
Yeah. I'm also thinking of, I remember when I was learning about this in seminary too, about the encounter between Ruth and Boaz on the threshing floor, where like, they kind of have this one night stand. And the wording in this passage is that Boaz, I heard, like, I think Ruth uncovers his feet, and it means that they got it on the threshing floor.
Yes, right.
And they weren't married or anything, and obviously they got married after that. But I remember I was really shocked when I read that, because like I had always been told, like I couldn't think of any like lawful example of someone having like sex outside of marriage in the Bible,
Right.
which I think kind of speaks to your point about how like the like it's much more fluid like in the biblical stories than we give it credit for.
Right. Oh, I mean, like, and this is the classic example that I think lots of people think of, but like, have you ever read Song of Songs? Like, there's,
Yeah.
like, that book is so, so sexual. And
Hmm.
I mean, my seminary professors would tell, like, we would, I went to a very sex positive school, but they were hung up on some really weird things. And they always said, like, well, yeah, but they were married. And we would, like, students, we would always push back and say, there is no evidence of marriage in this book. There is no
Hmm.
marriage ceremony. There is no, like, there's no indication in this book that that is actually that they were married. And a lot of people argue, like, no, they're not. Like, yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, we did always just like assume that they were married, but yeah, I mean that also another thing in your book that made me chuckle a bit was when you mentioned the book Every Young Man's Battle, which I didn't realize was so ubiquitous. I didn't realize like every young man got that. Like if you grew up conservative evangelical.
Mm-hmm.
And like you talk a little bit about like what it was like reading that as someone who is attracted to men. And
Uh-huh.
you talked about this like little like snippet at the end where like what to do if you're attracted to men.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Like, I mean, my dad literally handed that book to me in a brown paper bag. And I mean the book, you know, I mean it is so heteronormative, so heteronormative. Of course, like that's what it is. And I mean I was actually reading it like pretty turned on just overall by the book. But then there is like at the end of it, like I mean I think it's a page and a half of like what to do if you're attracted to men. And it was, I mean, woefully inadequate. Just I don't remember. I think I've blocked that part out of my memory of that book, but
Mhm.
it's it was very inadequate. Um, mm,
Yeah, I mean, I think like another thing recently, I like I think that may have come from like focus on the family or something like adjacent to that. And I've recently kind of been like realizing how like James Dobson wrote this book called Bringing Up Boys that was
mhm.
also like very popular at the time, along with Every Young Man's Battle. And I recently like looked it up on Amazon just to see like what was he actually writing about. And it's a lot of the stuff that like people are talking about today, like how like men just can't be men anymore and that like
Right.
they're so oppressed and everything. And I think I didn't really realize that a lot of that was so core to purity culture that
Mhm.
was everywhere in the 90s
Mhm. Yeah.
and
And
how it's still showing up today.
uh-huh. It's deeply rooted in patriarchy,
Hmm.
and gender hierarchy, and in these ideas of here's the definition of a man, here's the definition of a woman. And if we fall outside of those kind of really rigid ideas, then everything is going to go to hell. And um, it's
Yeah,
really messed up. Mm, yeah.
yeah. Um, so I think like another thing I'm thinking of is like what are so like so if you're in a situation like where like maybe you're just coming out, you're kind of like thinking about like, oh, like what do my sexual ethics mean to me? What advice would you give to someone like that for like
Hmm.
how to think about this or like where to go to for help or like what kind of communication styles you should be using with partners?
Hmm.
What would you tell that person?
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing I would say is go find a sex education course, and I think that is one of the beauties of living in this kind of post COVID or semi post. We're not post COVID, but this like COVID world is that there's so many courses have moved online that you can find. I don't know any off the top of my head, but I know they're out there of like, you can just take a sexual education course online, privacy of your home, and learn the things that you were never taught. That'd be one thing. Like, learn about safe sex, learn about like all these things that are really important. So that just like practically have sex in a way that is safe.
Mm-hmm.
I think the next thing that I would say though to folks is, and this is one of the paradoxes in my book, is like, it's okay to make mistakes. Like you actually will make mistakes. And like, I mean, I think about sexuality in some ways as the language of our bodies. And I kind of compare it to what it's like to learn a new language. And when you're learning a new language, the only way you're going to become fluent in it is by speaking and failing. Like that is how you learn a language, is you go out there, you try it. You are really, really, really bad at it. But slowly over time, it's making those mistakes that actually allows you to get better, that actually allows you to become fluent. And I think about sexuality in a similar way of, it's not going to go great. In fact, you may have a lot of really bad sex, and that is okay. And that is how you kind of learn your body, learn another person's body, what you like, what you don't like, and it's okay to make mistakes.
Yeah, I think that that's something I've like noticed my own life too. Like when I realized that I was still carrying a lot of that like evangelical shame with me in a non-moralistic sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like where I would try something new and then I'd feel awful about it.
Mm-hmm.
Not even connecting it to any sort of like biblical moralism or anything. And I think that also kind of goes back to yeah, like accepting that you're gonna make mistakes. And like doing your best to just be honest and communicate that to who you're engaging with. I'm also thinking about I remember like something that was really important for me when I first came out was I had a friend who would like go with me, like he would go with me to get tested for my first time, like STI testing. And I remember being terrified going to do that because like you feel so vulnerable, like sitting in that chair, like waiting for the nurse.
Yeah.
And most of the time these nurses are like extremely nice because they know you're like scared. They can
Right.
like tell if it's your first time. And then like getting your finger pricked and everything and like waiting for the results to come out. It's like so it's very anxiety producing. And so I think I'm also kind of thinking about like for people who are like just coming out and people who are starting to experiment, like go with them to get tested because I think we kind of underestimate how scary it is and we underestimate how easy it is to do.
Yes. Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's so easy, but also so intimidating if it's your first time or even first couple of times. Like,
Yeah.
yeah. Mm.
Yeah. And you feel ashamed of it sometimes.
Right. I mean, because again, all of those messages come kind of flooding back in. And I think we tend to moralize because STIs were moralized, at least in my world growing up, like
Yeah.
as like the curse of the flesh that like I think my mom would always say like, what is that verse about? Like, he who sins sexually sins against his own body, and like she used that as like, that's STIs, that's AIDS, that's, I mean, like all of these things of like, this is just evidence of promiscuity, and
Yeah.
like, yeah, you'll die.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and another thing I'm thinking of too is like how I guess I kind of lost my train of thought here, but I think like one thing is like how like we police our own thoughts, and that's something that like purity culture does as well. Like where
Mm-hmm.
we feel bad for even like thinking about lustful things. And there's a verse in the Bible that I think like says, like, I think Paul wrote it, where like even like thinking these things, like we feel guilty about them all of a sudden.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. I mean, it reminds me of when I went to a church camp growing up. One of my camp counselors, this is like seared into my memory, taught us this phrase of think about what you think about before you think about it so you don't think about it.
Oh, really? I haven't heard that.
And I remember like when I was a kid being like, oh, that's great. Like that's so helpful. And now I'm like, what an awful thing. Think about what you think about before you think about it so you don't think about it. This idea of really having to be so intense around your thought life because it might lead you to sin, or having these thoughts are sinful in and of themselves. Um, when in reality, like, I mean, personally, I don't think there's anything wrong with feeling sexual attraction towards another person. Like,
Hmm.
and then we also get to choose what we do with those feelings. Like, it's not like we lose agency just because we're thinking about something. And our bodies are, again, I think they're designed to experience attraction, experience sexuality, experience eros. I mean, it's a form of love that is encoded into our bodies. And when we try to split that off, we're splitting off a whole lot more than just what we think we're splitting.
Yeah. Someone just came in on the chat saying that the wording of this verse was like Jesus said something about someone who lusts after a woman has already committed adultery in his heart,
Yeah.
which sounds like pretty harsh words. Um, but yeah, I mean,
But I think, and
go
I
ahead.
think the question there is then what is lust? Like,
Mm,
I mean, lust was defined to me growing up as you think a thought, you have a feeling of attraction. That is lust. Like any sexual feeling is lustful. Um,
mm,
can we question that? Can we play with this idea of how are we defining lust? And is lust just the experience of sexuality?
mm,
Not quite sure that that's what Jesus was talking about.
yeah. Um, and we haven't touched on this yet, but you also talk in your book about the like what the impact of mandated celibacy does to queer people.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. So, I mean, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, in the worlds where I grew up, I think there's an offshoot of purity culture, but not just purity culture. It was like the only option. Well, that's not quite true. I originally grew up in a world where, like, the goal, if you experience same sex attraction, which is what we called it, the goal was to become straight, right? So conversion therapy, essentially. That's the
Hmm.
world that I was in. That kind of shifted as I was in my teens and like early 20s into this idea of being queer, being gay, being attracted to the same gender or different genders. Like that in itself is not sinful, but any action on it is sinful. And so it turned into this idea of mandated celibacy for queer people. Like you're just called
Yeah.
to be celibate. And I mean, I think I deeply believe that again, when we cut off or attempt to cut off our sexuality, that is this
Yeah.
deep part of who we are, I think we're also cutting our ability to be in relationship with other people. Because
Yeah.
not only, I mean, you're cutting off the sexuality, but you're also pretending to be something you're not. You're also kind of starting to build relationships on a false premise. And I get into this a lot more in the book, but it's a lot more than just sexuality. We lose pretty big parts of ourselves when we try to partition off in a way that is mandated or forced. And I think it's different when folks choose into celibacy, making
Yeah.
like fully informed decisions. I think there is a difference there. Um, but again, with so much cultural kind of pressure around it, I think it's really hard to make an informed decision and a fully free decision into celibacy. But I mean, we're not in a vacuum. I don't know. Does that make sense? Like,
I wanted to say too, like people, if you want to like start putting your questions in the chat, we can start answering those soon. But I mean, you said earlier that you're kind of working at this intersection of like the divine and sex, and there was something else too. But I
shame.
think shame, yeah. So I mean, I I mean this is making me think like when I first came out, I realized how like intertwined all of that was for me,
Mhm.
because I realized that it was very hard for me to have like what other people called like spiritual experiences. And I remember like talking to like my chaplain at seminary about how it felt like I had my spiritual nerve endings burn off.
Mm,
And so like when I first went into seminary, I didn't feel like a very like quote I kind of hate like using this word even. I didn't feel like a very spiritual person.
mhm.
Because I like growing up, I would always see other people in church who would like have these like they felt very close to God or something. And like I never like I was always involved with church, but I never quite felt that way. Um, and it took a lot of therapy and then 2 years of seminary and then a lot of work with my chaplain to undo all that and try to find my own spirituality. But I had to enter that through my queerness
Mhm.
because that was the source of the pain and the trauma, which is
Right.
why I think this is like things like conversion therapy are like I can't think of many things worse than it because it's like hurting people at two of the most vulnerable core places of their identity. One being
Mhm.
how they love and how they have their being in the world, and the other is like how they experience the divine,
Right.
which I can't think of like anything worse than that, like damaging that. And so like I think I'm like particularly very sensitive to that. Like it's I'm at a privileged point that I've been able to like work through a lot of this stuff through the help of like therapy and like people who have helped me. Not everyone's there,
Mhm.
nor should they like get to wherever I
Right.
am, because everyone needs their like what they need to find what works for them.
Yeah.
But that's why I like that you kind of talk about like the intersection of those things and how it's so core to who we are.
Mhm. Right. Right. Yeah.
And then I think we're gonna stop recording right now, and then we'll do some questions, just like off the record.
Great.
So we'll say goodbye to like the YouTube crowd right now. Okay.